On a snowy city street, a weary mechanic noticed a child selling wilted flowers with trembling hands. He pressed his last few dollars into her palm and led her into a small cafe for warmth. What he could never have imagined was that this fragile girl would one day stand before a crowd and call him the only father she ever knew. Before we begin, where are you watching from? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Beneath the glittering lights of a street lined with expensive restaurants, a child needed only $5 to survive, yet faced nothing but cruel laughter echoing through the winter night. Daniel Carter dragged his weary feet across the snow-covered sidewalk, each step leaving deep impressions in the slush. His weathered work coat, stained with dried paint from construction jobs, hung loose around his shoulders. His cracked boots squeaked against the wet pavement, and his breath came out in heavy clouds that dissipated in the frigid air. All he could think about was collapsing onto the sagging mattress in his cramped studio apartment. At the corner where the upscale district met the older part of town, a small figure caught his attention. 6-year-old Maeve stood beneath the harsh glow of a street lamp, her tangled hair falling around a face flushed red from the biting wind. In her tiny hands she clutched a small bouquet of wild daisies, their white petals already wilting from the cold. Her thin jacket flapped open as she shivered. 4 men in expensive suits had just emerged from Chez Laurent, their faces flushed with warmth and alcohol. The scent of cologne mixed with wine clung to their clothing as they discussed business deals with loud, confident voices. Maeve took a tentative step toward them, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please, just $5, 1 flower." Her words came out in stutters, partly from the cold and partly from fear that made her hands tremble as she held up the modest bouquet. The tallest man, his silver hair perfectly styled, lifted his chin and let out a laugh that had no warmth. "You call these flowers?" His voice dripped with disdain as he looked down at the child. Without warning, he raised his polished leather shoe and brought it down hard on the bouquet, grinding the delicate petals into the dirty snow beneath his heel. The white daisies scattered and crumpled, their broken stems mixing with the gray slush. The other 3 men burst into laughter that rang out harsh and cold, the sound bouncing off the brick buildings as they walked away, their expensive shoes clicking against the pavement. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks, exhaustion evaporating as familiar rage built in his chest. His heart clenched tight as he watched the little girl sink to her knees, her small fingers shaking as she tried desperately to gather the ruined flowers. The sight transported him back 30 years to his own childhood when bigger kids would destroy his things just to watch him suffer. "I've seen this cruelty before," he thought. Daniel walked over to where Maeve knelt on the cold concrete. $50, he said, his voice rough from years of construction work. "For all of them." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled wad of bills, almost everything from his last paycheck, keeping just enough for tomorrow, money he had been saving for groceries and his overdue electric bill. He pressed the money into her small hands, which were red and chapped from the cold, then knelt down beside her in the slush. One by one he picked up each damaged flower, handling them as gently as if they were made of crystal. When he stood up and turned to face the 4 men who had paused to watch, his eyes held a calm intensity that made them shift uncomfortably. 4 grown men against a little girl, Daniel said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that cut through the winter air. "That's shame, not fun." His gaze moved from one man to another, and each of them found something important to look at on the ground. Without another word they hurried away into the night, their confident laughter replaced by uncomfortable silence. Maeve stared down at the crumpled bills in her palms, her heart racing as she tried to process what had just happened. For the first time in her young life, she felt what it was like to have someone stand between her and the world's cruelty, to have protection when she had expected nothing but indifference. Daniel held the crushed bouquet carefully in his calloused hands, the broken stems and bruised petals somehow more precious than any expensive arrangement. He didn't say anything more, but simply placed his rough paint-stained hand gently on the child's shoulder, his eyes holding a warmth that cut through the bitter cold of the winter night. As they stood there in the aftermath of the confrontation, Daniel noticed that Maeve was still trembling violently, her small body shaking not just from the shock of what had happened, but from the bone-deep cold that seemed to penetrate right through her threadbare jacket. The wind had picked up, sending swirls of snow dancing around their feet, and he could see her lips turning blue despite her efforts to stop her teeth from chattering. "Come on," Daniel said quietly, his breath forming thick white clouds in the frigid air. "Let's get you warm." Daniel guided Maeve to a small cafe that looked forgotten by time. The building's brick walls were cracked, paint peeling around the windows, and the neon sign flickered erratically. When they pushed through the heavy glass door, the waitress looked up with surprise at the unusual sight, a black construction worker accompanied by a small girl whose tangled hair and dirty coat marked her as one of the street children. Daniel pulled out a wobbly chair for Maeve, his movements careful and gentle. He glanced at the worn menu, then looked up at the waitress. "One hot chocolate with extra whipped cream for her, and just a black coffee for me." When the drinks arrived, Maeve lifted the hot chocolate with both hands, her fingers wrapping around the ceramic as if it were the most precious thing she had ever held. She took a careful sip, and a small mustache of white cream appeared on her upper lip. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a rare smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, softening the hard lines that years of disappointment had carved into his weathered face. "What's your name, little one?" Daniel asked gently. "Maeve," she whispered. "Where's your home?" The question came out before Daniel could stop himself. Maeve's eyes dropped to stare into her hot chocolate, her small fingers turning the handle in slow circles. "You don't have to tell me now," Daniel said quietly. After several minutes, Maeve looked up with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. You're not like them. I've seen men like them all my life," Daniel said slowly. "But I promised myself I wouldn't become one of them." Without thinking, Daniel pulled off his worn work gloves and pushed them across the table toward Maeve. "Your hands are colder than mine." Maeve hesitated, then slipped her small hands into the oversized gloves, her eyes growing bright with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. She looked down at the damaged flowers on the table, then back up at Daniel. "They're still beautiful," she said softly, gently touching one of the bruised petals. "Even broken, they're still flowers." Daniel felt his throat tighten at her words. This little girl understood something that those wealthy men never would. The two of them sat in the warm silence that followed, sharing something more valuable than words in the humble space of the rundown cafe. In that moment, the first fragile thread was woven between them, born not just from an act of protection, but from the simple recognition that neither of them had to face the cold world entirely alone. When they stepped outside, the winter night had transformed into something menacing. Wind howled through the streets, thick snowflakes swirled so densely that streetlights became dim halos, and pedestrians hurried past searching for shelter. Maeve pulled her thin jacket tighter, shivering uncontrollably. Daniel glanced down at her, feeling the familiar weight of helplessness in his chest. "Where are you going now?" Daniel asked gently. Maeve looked down at the snow accumulating around their feet. "I don't have anywhere," she whispered. Daniel stopped walking, his mind racing through possibilities and complications. His studio apartment was barely 20 square meters, with a leaky ceiling and a broken hot plate. Taking in a child would bring expenses he couldn't afford. But as he looked at Maeve shaking violently, he remembered sleeping under overpasses as a child, waking up with frost in his hair. "If I walk away now, she'll be just like I was," he thought. Alone, frozen, forgotten. After several minutes of internal struggle, Daniel knelt down until he was at eye level with her. His voice became softer than it had been all evening. "Hey little one, would you like to come home with me? Just for tonight, until the storm passes. You don't have to be cold anymore." As Maeve's breathing became slow and even, Daniel watched her sleep and realized that for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. Outside, the storm raged, but inside their small sanctuary, two invisible people had found each other. Maeve's eyes widened in shock, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just heard. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her mouth slightly open, searching his face for any sign that this might be some kind of cruel joke. When she realized he was serious, her expression crumpled with overwhelming emotion, and she nodded quickly, unable to find words through the tears that had suddenly filled her eyes. He led her through a series of increasingly narrow alleyways, past buildings where the paint peeled in long strips and graffiti covered most surfaces. The boarding house where he lived sat at the end of a dead-end street, its brick facade stained with decades of soot and neglect, the front steps cracked and uneven from countless freeze-thaw cycles. When Daniel opened the door to his apartment, the contrast between his simple offering and the luxury establishments they had passed earlier became painfully clear. The single room contained a narrow iron bed that creaked at the slightest movement, a wooden table with one corner propped up by a stack of books to keep it level, and a hot plate that had more rust than original metal. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows that made the already small space feel even more cramped. Daniel felt a flush of embarrassment as he watched Maeve take in his humble home, her wide eyes reflecting both exhaustion and overwhelming gratitude. The little girl's face was pale from cold and fatigue, her small frame seeming even tinier in the sparse room, yet she showed no judgment in her expression, only profound relief at being out of the storm. He quickly pulled the thin blanket from his bed and spread it on the floor beside the table, then took off his work jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders like a protective cocoon. "I know it's not much, sweetheart," he said gently, "but you'll be safe and warm here." He carefully placed the crushed bouquet on the windowsill, where the streetlight outside made the damaged petals glow softly in the darkness. Maeve sat on the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked around the simple room as if it were a palace, her eyes pausing on the flowers by the window. "No one ever let me stay before, no one ever called me sweetheart, no one ever said I could come home." She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. I thought nobody wanted me anywhere." Daniel settled himself on the floor, his back against the wall, looking up at the water-stained ceiling as his heart hammered in his chest. He had never been good with words, preferring action to conversation, but something about this moment demanded acknowledgement. "Then tonight is the first time," he said quietly. A peaceful silence settled over the small room, broken only by the wind rattling the windows and the occasional drip from the leak in the corner. But the cold that had followed them all evening was finally gone, replaced by the warmth that comes not from heat, but from human connection. As Maeve's breathing gradually became slow and even, Daniel watched her sleep and realized that for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone in the world. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside their small sanctuary, two people who had been invisible to the world had found each other. Morning crept into the narrow room through a sliver in the curtain. Daniel sat on the floor where he had slept, his back stiff, listening to the soft rhythm of Maeve's breathing. The storm had finally quieted, leaving a heavy blanket of snow over the city. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Then came the pounding on the door, sharp, impatient, and relentless. Daniel pushed himself up, heart tightening. He opened the door to find Mrs. Klein, the landlady, standing with one hand on her hip. She was a woman in her 50s, her thin lips pressed together, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Her eyes, pale and searching, darted past him into the room. They landed on the small figure curled on the bed, her brows arched high. "Daniel, what is this? A little white girl in your room. You know people will talk." Daniel straightened, blocking the doorway with his frame. His voice came out low, controlled, though every muscle inside him was tense. "She just needed shelter from the storm. That's all." Mrs. Klein crossed her arms, her tone dripping with judgment. "Storms don't last forever, but scandals do." The words hung in the air like smoke. Behind him he heard the faint rustle of movement. Maeve had woken. She sat up on the edge of the bed, her small hands twisting the hem of her shirt. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with alarm. She could hear every word. Her chest rose and fell quickly, and she thought, "Maybe he'll send me away now, just like everyone else did." Her throat tightened. The fragile warmth she had felt last night seemed ready to vanish in an instant, smothered by the harsh voices of the world outside. Daniel glanced back. The girl looked smaller than ever, sitting against the cold iron frame of the bed, her eyes glistening. He turned back to Mrs. Klein, his hand clenched against the doorframe, veins standing out. In his head the cruel whispers of memory echoed. A black man with a white child. They'll never trust you, they'll never let it go. But then he looked again at Maeve, the fear in her eyes, the way she shrank from the world, desperate for someone to say she mattered. He drew a long steady breath. His voice was firmer this time, his jaw set. "She's not a problem," he said. "She's under my care. If you can't live with that, I'll find another place." The landlady's lips pursed even tighter. She scoffed, muttering about rent and rules, then turned and stomped down the hall, but the damage was already done. Outside, other tenants had gathered, drawn by the noise. Faces peeked from cracked doors. Two men leaned against the railing, arms folded, eyes full of disdain. One of them spoke, his voice loud enough to carry. "This looks wrong, Daniel." The other added with a sneer, "You know what people are gonna think." Daniel met their gaze head on. His voice rang out steady, without apology. "What's wrong is leaving a child out in the cold." For a moment no one spoke, only the groan of pipes in the old hallway filled the silence. Daniel turned back inside. He held out his hand to Maeve. Her little fingers trembled before they reached for his, slipping into his palm with surprising strength. He stepped past the gawkers, guiding her with quiet certainty. The hallway seemed longer than usual, each step heavy under the weight of their stares, but Maeve clung tighter, her heart hammering, feeling both fear and something new, safety. When the door closed behind them again, the room felt smaller, but also more theirs. Daniel sank onto the chair, rubbing his face with both hands. His chest ached with anger and weariness, but also with resolve. "I've lived my whole life under their suspicion," he thought. "But she won't." On the bed, Maeve hugged her knees, her eyes searching him. The question slipped from her lips before she could stop it, barely more than a whisper. "Are you going to send me away?" Daniel froze, the words cutting deep. He looked at her for a long moment, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice came out slow, deliberate, each word heavy with meaning. "No," he said. "You're safe here." Maeve's breath shuddered as though something inside her had finally unclenched. She lowered her head, her fingers still gripping the blanket, but her eyes glimmered with a new light. For the first time, Daniel realized what he had spoken wasn't just comfort, it was a vow, a promise he could not take back. Outside, whispers would continue, judgments would sharpen like knives, but in that moment, in that small room with snow still piled high at the window, a bond had been sealed, not out of pity, not out of chance, but out of choice. The morning light fell weakly across the room, painting the peeling walls in pale gray. Daniel crouched on the floor with a screwdriver, tightening the loose screws on the old wooden chair. Every twist of the metal echoed in the silence. At the table, Maeve leaned over her notebook, tongue caught between her teeth as she copied letters. Her small fingers clutched the pencil tightly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Daniel glanced up and froze. On the page in large shaky letters, she had written Maeve Carter. His breath caught, his hands trembled around the screwdriver. "Is this what she wants? To be mine?" A warmth spread through his chest, but with it came a terrible weight. A name was more than a word, it was belonging. It was a claim on a life he wasn't sure the world would ever let him have. 2 days later, the knock came. It wasn't the hurried rap of a neighbor, or the sharp pounding of Mrs. Klein. This was steady, official. Daniel opened the door to a woman in a gray coat, clipboard in hand. Her hair was pulled tight into a bun, her expression as cold as the January wind behind her. "Mr. Carter?" she asked briskly. "Yes," Daniel said. She stepped forward, eyes scanning the small room. "We received a report. A child is living here." Her gaze fixed on Maeve, who sat frozen on the bed. "Are you her legal guardian?" Daniel swallowed hard, sweat prickling at his temples. His voice was steady, but low. "No, but I'm the only one she has." The woman scribbled quickly, her pen scratched against the paper like judgment itself. "That's not how the law works, Mr. Carter." Maeve looked at him, her face pale, eyes wide with confusion and dread. Daniel forced a reassuring nod, but inside, his heart was pounding like a drum. The following week, Daniel found himself sitting in a stiff chair at the social services office. The walls were beige, the air stale with the smell of old carpet. Across from him sat 2 officials, one, the woman from before, the other, a man with wire-rimmed glasses and a detached gaze. They shuffled through papers, speaking in clipped tones. "You're unemployed," the man said flatly, "barely affording rent, no stable family support," and he paused, letting the words linger. "You're a black man raising a white girl, it will raise questions." The words landed heavy. Daniel's fists tightened on his knees, his jaw locked. He leaned forward, his voice gravelly with restrained fire. "Questions won't keep her warm. Papers won't hold her when she cries at night." "I do." For a second, silence filled the room. The man adjusted his glasses but said nothing. The woman merely wrote more notes, her pen merciless. That night, Daniel sat awake while the building groaned around him. Snow ticked against the window. On the bed, Maeve slept curled up, her breath soft and even. He watched her, chest aching. Memories crashed in, his own childhood, ripped away when the state had taken him from his mother. He remembered the look on her face, desperate but powerless. He had grown up angry, wandering from one home to another, never belonging. Not again, he thought fiercely. Not this child, not my child. The words echoed inside him until they became a vow. The next morning, Daniel walked back into the social services building. His coat was patched, his boots worn, but his steps were firm. He carried a small folder under his arm, the sum of all he could gather. Inside were pay stubs from odd jobs, letters from neighbors who had seen him care for Maeve, and the crumpled bills of his savings. It wasn't much, but it was everything. He placed it on the desk in front of the gray-coated woman. I may not have much, he said, his voice rough but steady, but I have enough to give her a home. Check the neighbors, they'll tell you she's safe with me. His eyes locked on hers, refusing to waver. His hands shook, but not from fear, from conviction. The woman studied him for a long moment. Something flickered in her expression, not quite sympathy, but not indifference either. She nodded curtly. We'll see, Mr. Carter. But this won't be easy. On the way home, Daniel held Maeve's hand as they walked down the icy street. Her small boots crunched in the snow beside his larger ones. She glanced up at him, hesitant, as though afraid of the answer. Am I really going to stay with you? Daniel stopped. He turned to her fully, his breath visible in the cold air. For a moment he couldn't speak. His throat was tight. Finally, he bent down, meeting her eyes, his voice low and firm. Yes, he said. As long as I breathe, you'll never be alone again. Maeve's lips trembled, then broke into the faintest smile. She squeezed his hand tighter, as though anchoring herself to the promise. Daniel straightened, his gaze lifting to the horizon. He knew the road ahead would be hard, full of papers, judges and sideways looks, but he also knew there was no turning back. This was no longer an act of kindness, it was a choice, a lifelong vow, and for the first time in years, Daniel Carter felt that maybe, just maybe, he had finally found his purpose. When the gymnasium filled with voices, it sounded like the hum of a restless sea. Folding chairs squeaked against the polished floor, parents whispered to one another, the air carrying the smell of paper programs and fresh paint. On the stage, a row of students sat in pressed shirts and borrowed dresses, their eyes darting nervously toward the microphone. Standing alone at the center, Daniel sat in the second row, his hands resting on his knees, his shoulders too broad for the narrow chair. The years had put silver at his temples and calluses deeper into his palms, but his eyes never left the small figure sitting 3 seats from the edge. Maeve, now 17, her hair neatly tied back, the corners of her mouth pressed together in concentration. The principal spoke first, his words rolling over the crowd about perseverance and hard work. Applause rose, then faded. Names were called, certificates handed out, laughter echoing when cameras flashed, but Daniel barely heard it. His heart was too busy beating with the rhythm of memory, each thump bringing back another piece of the road that had led here. The snowy night when he opened his door, the harsh knock of social workers, the long days of labor just to keep a roof overhead. He sat straighter, as Maeve's name was spoken. She walked to the microphone with steps that were careful but steady. For a moment, she gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. The lights above cast a soft glow on her face, and when she lifted her eyes, they searched the crowd until they found Daniel. Her lips parted, and the tremor in her first word was carried by the microphone, so that the whole room could hear. My name is Maeve Carter, she began. Her voice wavered, but then it grew, stronger with each syllable. And I stand here today, not just because of what I have done, but because of what was given to me. The room hushed, as though everyone sensed something deeper than an ordinary student speech was about to unfold. Daniel leaned forward, his rough hands gripping each other tightly, his breath caught in his chest. There was a time, Maeve said slowly, when I thought no one would ever want me. I was just a girl on the street, cold and hungry, waiting for the world to decide if I mattered. And then someone who had nothing to give but his own tired hands and his stubborn heart, looked at me and said, "You're safe here. That man is my father. His name is Daniel Carter." The sound of his name spoken out loud like that, in front of strangers, made Daniel's throat tighten until it hurt. For years he had lived braced against suspicion, against whispers and questions, against the long shadow of poverty, and the harder shadow of race. But here, on this stage, his name was not a point of doubt, it was a declaration. Maeve went on, her voice clearer now, like a river gathering speed. He worked jobs no one else wanted, came home with his back aching and his boots heavy with mud, and still found a way to fix a chair so I could study, or to save a piece of bread so I wouldn't go to bed hungry. When the world said he was not enough, he showed me that love can be more than enough. When the law said we didn't belong together, he fought to keep me, and because of him, I learned how to believe in tomorrow. She paused, blinking quickly as though holding back tears. Daniel shifted in his chair, his eyes burning, his chest swelling with pride and pain all at once. He wanted to stand, to reach out, to hold her the way he had when she was small, but he knew this was her moment. "I am here," Maeve continued softly, "because one man chose not to walk away. He chose to stay, he chose me, and every step I take from this day forward, I take as his daughter." For a heartbeat silence hung heavy in the gym, so thick that even the sound of breathing seemed loud. Then applause erupted, thunderous and rising, filling every corner of the room. Some people wiped their eyes, others clapped until their hands stung. Daniel remained seated, his head bowed, his shoulders trembling. He had never sought recognition, he had only wanted to keep a promise whispered in the dark of a freezing night. Yet hearing her say those words was more than recognition, it was redemption. When the program ended and students crowded off the stage into the arms of their families, Maeve found him. She pushed through the sea of people, her gown swaying, her eyes fixed on him as though he was the only person there. Daniel rose to his feet, taller than most around him, but suddenly feeling small beneath the weight of her gaze. She wrapped her arms around him without hesitation, holding him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. Daniel's arms closed around her, his rough hands cradling her as though she were still that shivering child he had carried through the storm. He bent his head, his lips close to her hair. "No," he said softly, his voice breaking. "Thank you for letting me be your father." In that moment, time seemed to fold back on itself, the years of struggle, the countless doubts, the cold nights and hungry mornings, and all of it was bound together by the warmth of a single embrace. Around them, the crowd moved on, but for Daniel and Maeve, the world had narrowed to a circle of love that no suspicion, no law, no hardship could break. The journey that had begun with snow and silence, ended here with applause and light. And though the years ahead would still hold challenges, Daniel knew he had kept his vow. He had given her more than shelter, he had given her a name, a future, a father's heart. As they walked out of the gymnasium together, the setting sun spilled through the tall windows, bathing the floor in gold. Maeve lifted her head, smiling, her steps confident beside his. Daniel Carter, once just a man trying to survive the world's indifference, now walked with the certainty that he had changed a life, and perhaps, in some quiet way, the life he had changed most was his own.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.